Hi
Yes,
everybody, and welcome back for the break. I'm delighted to be interviewing Tara Prem. I'm sure you know about Tara, but I'm just going to give you her bio just to remind of all the wonderful things that she's done. So Tara Prem is a film and television drama producer. At the BBC, she worked as a script editor, director and producer for English Regions drama at Pebble Mill, where she was in charge of the Second City Fair series of new dramas, which brought Alan Bleasdale, Willie Russell and Ian McEwan, among others, to television audiences. She also produced early works by director Stephen Frears, Mike Newell and Mike Lee. Her credits for Play for Today include as script editor Pen de Sven, Three for the Fancy, and Breathe. And as well as we discovered another one on the list yesterday, Lovely Man's Lover, and as producer Vampires and Thicker Than Water. She produced Paul Greengrass's first feature film Resurrected in 1989 and Jimmy McGovern's award-winning drama series Hearts and Minds in 1995. Her own screenplay, A Touch of Eastern Promise from 1973, was the first television drama to have an all-Asian cast and dealt with the lives of an ordinary Asian family in the inner city. So Tara, if I may kick us off, to go back to the early years of your career and thinking about your time starting off as working at television as a trainee script editor in the early 70s, how did you come to work for English Regions Drama in Birmingham?
Well, I started out working in the theatre. I was an actress, and then I moved to America for a bit and did some directing. But I'd been very influenced by the Wednesday play, which I'd found absolutely fantastic. And so I sort of thought that television would be the place to be more than theatre. And very luckily, I was able to get a job as a script editor. But I got a script editor. It was a trainee script editor. And initially I was put to work on Play of the Month, which was exactly in London, which was exactly what I didn't really want to do, because these were the things that had been talked about during the day. They were the classic adaptations of theatre, Ibsen and Chekhov. I mean, they were fine, but they really were very, very theatrical. And this is not what I had in mind at all. But very luckily, the English Regions drama had just started, and I knew Barry Hanson, and that was exactly what I wanted to do. And so I asked if I could leave Play of the Month and go up to Birmingham. That's how I went to Birmingham.
And that was around about 1972 as well. And there, of course, was where you wrote your landmark play, A Touch of Eastern Promise, in 1974. As we've said there, the first drama to have an all-Asian cast. Can you tell us a bit about how that drama came about to be?
Well, when I went up to Birmingham, we talked about exactly what the brief of English Regions drama was. And David Rose had been given a very specific brief, and Barry was there to help him do it. And it was to reflect life in the English regions, nothing set in London, and reflect the regions. And my father was Indian. My father was an Indian actor in 1932 in England at the BBC. He used to, was part of the department, wasn't a department, an outfit who did Shakespeare, Shaw, Chekhov in Hindi and Urdu and broadcast it back to India. And so when I got to Birmingham, and I just looked out of the window and I saw that there was a big Indian population there. And I said, you know, if we're going to reflect the English regions, we should reflect what's right here on our doorstep outside Pebble Mill. And that's, you know, an Indian community. It wasn't as big a community as it is now, but it was still pretty sizable and pretty important. And because that was one of the things about the way David and Barry worked, they said, yes, right, well, absolutely, get on with it. And so they gave me the job of getting on with it. And I realized that there was, and I did try, there was nobody there to write it. So I said, I would like to write it because I know what I would like to write. And that's how I did. I wrote it. And it was the first drama to feature an all-Asian cast. And as I think I said to you yesterday, until A Suitable Boy a few months ago, it was still the only one.
And that puts into stark contrast, doesn't it, what we're talking about in terms of levels of inequality and lack of diversity at the moment. So we're going to kind of come back to that perhaps in a little while. But I was just thinking about actually, obviously you were writing then in 74, and I think you'd made the switch to being a producer for Second City First by that point as well. Is that right, Tara? Was that right?
No, it was a bit. It was quite early on. I was still the script editor for a bit, and then I did direct a few, and then I moved. Barry moved on, and I took over Second City First. But I think I had a series or quite a few plays that I was script editor on before I moved into being a producer.
And is that how it works in production, Tara? Back in that period that you kind of learn your craft as a script editor, and then it would be an organic process of moving into the role of producer, or is it something that you actively have to kind of seek out or choose to do?
I think you have to choose it, but it was a sort of natural progression at the time. Although things were quite fluid in Birmingham, you could do different things in the sense that I could write, and then I could direct, and then I could produce as well. And then I sort of chose one path because I think there was a feeling then that if you became a producer, you shouldn't start trying to direct all the plays as well. So I kind of slid out of directing into full-time producing.
Well, that's interesting. Why was that? Did they suggest that you shouldn't try and do both? Was that just for?
Well, I don't think that it said that you shouldn't do both, but I can see that if you were a producer and you gave yourself all the jobs, that wasn't going to go down well with all the directors. So it was really that.
Okay, so
picking and choosing all the things that you fancied, and then going, "Oh, I'll do that." Was you had to let the directors direct.
Yes, not having all the sweets in the sweet shop.
Exactly.
And just going back to A Touch of Eastern Promise for a moment, can you remember what reaction was like when it was first broadcast? Do you remember the kind of reception of that at all?
Well, it was quite well received. I mean, it was very well received, and I think that one of the things that has come out listening to the various things that have been talked about today is that its actual concentration on being about Indians in Birmingham wasn't really the main focus, and it was something that I had tried to do very deliberately. It was a fantasy. It was a fantasy about a young boy's aspirations, and because he came from that background, his aspirations and his fantasies were about Indian films, which played an enormous part in his life. But it was deliberately not trying to see it as a problem or a confrontational thing. It was people getting on with their lives, and as I say, it was a young man's fantasy, really, and so people reacted to it as that. I don't actually remember anybody saying, "Oh my God, it was a play full of Asians," which was good. I mean, that was really what I'd hoped.
Yeah, I'd hoped it'd be celebrated really for having something.
I think it was just taken as a play about people.
And I wonder if that is again part of the context and when it was produced and broadcast, that it wasn't, that it wasn't, it didn't create waves. It was accepted that you might have difference and diversity in that respect. But it's something I guess that we crave a bit more at the moment. That we're very conscious that there's difference isn't, or diversity has been such an issue up until very recent, as you say, until more recent texts have been produced.
Well, the thing is, what I always felt was that because my father was Indian, I could see that there were a lot of Indians in Birmingham and that you had to write about it, and I took it, and because of that, I wrote Eastern Promise, and because the department and the films and plays that were being done were very open, it opened the way then for other things Michael Abbenset's and Empire Road and Barry Record, other diverse writers. And I think it's a lot of what happens is when people consider it a problem or an issue that has to be addressed, people don't realize, and I've tried to say this in certain things, is that if you can do a film or a play which works absolutely in its own right as a play, people will just accept it. It won't seem like we are dealing with a problem or we're dealing with diversity. And I think it was just the fact that I looked out of the window and recognized this was a sort of opened the window, and then people became open to doing other plays that reflected this world.
Yeah.
And I mean, Birmingham's not so far from Wolverhampton, and Enoch Powell had made his really chilling speech not so long before. So these were difficult times. And so to have something that dealt with on a fantastical level, yet realist, seems to me the best way of dealing with these things in the drama form. I mean, not that there weren't, and there were more polemical pieces, more overtly political pieces, which is, good too. It was just that I think that Eastern Promise, because it just kicked open the door and was accepted for what it was, then the other things got made.
Yeah, and I'm conscious of time, but I could quite easily talk to you for an hour about A Touch of Eastern Promise, and I think you just to chime with what you're saying, I think it avoided that necessary sense of having a burden of representation to be about a particular social issue, as you quite rightly said. So obviously a pioneering work there. And obviously while you're working in English Regions drama, you're working on Second City first, but also started to work on some plays for Today as script editor and producer as well. What was your experience of working on Play for Today?
Well, the thing is, I think we were talking about this yesterday, that Birmingham's brief was 12 half hours, and I'm not sure, maybe 4 or 5 plays for Today a year that were very specific in the English Regions output and different from the London output. And so there was not much division. There weren't 2 separate lots of people doing half-hour plays or Play for Today. We were all doing everything. And in a sense, the plays for Today, from my point of view, were a bit like Second City First, but longer. They were things that turned out that fitted into the Play for Today mold, rather than saying we have to make 12 plays for Today that are this specific thing. So they were very varied, very, very different. They were things that David liked. David was really the person, as much as the overall input for half hours was Barry and then me. Play for Today was really David's responsibility, so that it reflected his views and his things that he liked and the things that he would get behind. But he would also take advice from us if we had things to propose. But I think probably something like Penda's Fen was utterly him. He just liked it. He liked it was sort of relatively near to Birmingham. He liked David Rudkin, and so he commissioned it, and it was a Play for Today.
Yeah, you made me chuckle yesterday when we were going through, reviewing the list of plays that you'd worked on Play for Today, and we talked about Penda's Fen, and you said that you did absolutely nothing really on that you didn't have to do anything.
I didn't do anything. It was because I was telling you the different levels of involvement. I was involved. I was the script editor, but actually, if you had a combination of David Rudkin and Alan Clark and David Rose, there was nothing for me to do. I think I might have gone to a meeting with David and Alan Clark in David's home in the country, not far from Birmingham, and I think I contributed nothing. I probably sat with his wife having a cup of tea in the kitchen while they did the important stuff on the script, and then we'd all left together and said, oh, that was great. and then David Rudkin would send in the whatever they talked about, and I would probably put the pages together. But there was no, I must have to say, there was very little creative contribution to it.
And did you say there was other works? When we spoke yesterday, you had to have a bit more input, that there was a few more.
Well, there was some. I just told you that there were different things. There were some where I had a contribution which was quite different, and that was The Lonely Man's Lover by Barry Collins, which was, I had worked as a script editor on it, so I had some input. But and Brian Parker directed it, and it was the script was finalised and sent off to be photocopied or whatever. It was much more complicated then, but anyway, it was a big deal to get the thing done on the Gestett and all the rest, and it landed on my desk, and it was called The Halfway House. And I thought, that's funny, I thought it was What's Happened, I've got the wrong script here. And then I realized that it was the right script, and I thought, but it's called The Halfway House and it's supposed to be called The Lonely Man's Lover. So I went off and said, why is it called The Halfway House? Oh, because that Lonely Man's Lover is far too sentimental. We can't have a sentimental title like that. It's awful. And I said, well, you can't just change a title like that, because this is a wonderful poetic title and you've made it a plodding, boring title. So I had a bit of a tussle about that. But that's, that's part of the job. I had to protect the writer's, right to have a poetic title instead of a plodding title. And, I somehow feel that that was an important contribution as well in its own way.
Yes, absolutely. I'm sure that is on the writer's behalf, they wouldn't be too pleased if their work suddenly was changed. And I think you said you also had a story about Shakespeare or Bust.
Yes, I know. I will repeat it because, but some people might have heard it. It was just the absolute different approach. I realised that perhaps it's not quite as different, because I heard Richard Eyre this morning say that he had to put a fiver under the door every time he wanted a page out of Peter McDougall. So that's also an original way of getting a script out of a writer. But I was the script editor on Shakespeare or Bust. When I went up to Birmingham, they'd done The Fishing Party, which was very successful. So David Rose asked Peter Turson to write a sequel. And he said, yes, he'd got this idea about Art, Ern and Abe, the three miners, going to Stratford on a barge. Peter Turson was a boatman, so he liked a boat. And David said, why don't you do the actual journey that they're going to do? And then you can write it as you go. So he did. So he was on a barge, and this is before mobile phones or anything like that. So and a barge goes very slowly. So it took him quite a long time to go from Birmingham or wherever he started to Stratford. And he would write, and it would take him maybe a week, and he'd have 10 pages, and he'd get to a lockkeeper's cottage, and he'd use the phone, and then he'd say, I've got another 10 pages. And then he'd write another 10 pages, and I'd go and get them. And he'd write another 10 pages until he more or less had the script. And they got to Stratford, but he didn't have an ending. So he said, well, they've got to Stratford, because that was the aim, was to go to Stratford upon Avon to see a play by Shakespeare. They get there, and Peter said, I know what the ending is. They can't get in. It's full and they can't get in. But that's a bit downbeat and depressing, so we ought to have something a bit more positive as an end. So they're going to meet the actors, and somehow the actors are going to do some Shakespeare, the Antony and Cleopatra, for them. And I don't know how that is. You sort it out, just sort it out. And I did, and they did beat the actors, and that's how it ended.
So you had to actually initiate contact with the actors
yourself?
No,
I didn't have to do that, but I had to come up with the idea. His idea was they didn't get in, but somehow they were still going to see, the actors were going to come out. So I didn't have the idea, but what I mean is the logistics of how they were going to get from the scene where they say, I'm afraid you can't come in because it's sold out, to them actually being on the barge with the actors playing Antony and Cleopatra, so that the three miners do see it in the end.
And is it quite stressful, and is it quite a fraught process when you're kind of waiting for the stories to come at that, and you're trying to, it sounds awfully creative, but it must be quite stressful, I imagine, to try
well,
and
no, because by this time I'd lived with this journey, and I knew that it wasn't, as I say, it wasn't that I was asked to come up with the end itself. It was just that he'd done the journey, he'd come up with the idea, they weren't going to get in, but we wanted an ending where they did somehow see the play, even though they hadn't got in. So it was just a way of, what should we do? Oh, I don't know. You sort it out.
Oh, excellent. And I was thinking about, it sounds like you inhabited a quite a close-knit community in English Regions drama as you working there. And it leads me on nicely really to the next question, which was when you were interviewed for the History of Women in Film and Television project back in 2015, which feels like yesterday. You just won an award for outstanding contribution to media because of your pioneering work on A Touch of Eastern Promise. Yes. And during that interview, you discussed the difficulty that so-called BAME writers experience trying to get a foot in the door. And so I really want to follow up on that and revisit that 5 years later now, to thinking about your experience of working, in your memory of working back in the 70s and early 80s as a script editor and producer in English Regions drama. And did questions of race and gender impact your experience of working there? Because it sounds very different when we're talking yesterday. Your experience sounds very different to the
I don't think it really did at all. And as I've been listening to people talking about this, over the course of today, I was thinking that in the 80s and 90s, I would say nobody really tried to stop me doing anything in Birmingham. It was possible. Nobody said you can't do that because you're a woman or anything. But I have to say that in my subsequent career as a television and film producer, I haven't had any, you couldn't say that I've been discriminated against, but people have said things to me that were really quite shocking, and that nobody would have said to me in the 70s. It's just, really things like trying to work with a woman director on a project. This was as an independent, I would go with the project and say, this is the director, and this is the short film, and would you like to see the work? And the person who might be going to give me the money or back it or whatever would go, is she good looking? Because that would be a help.
What, the director?
This is me taking, yes, a woman director, but the backer is asking me whether the director's good looking, yeah, as a question. And what do you say? I mean, I was shocked.
When would that have been, Tara? If you trace that back when you're working as an independent, what sort of decade are we talking about? The 90s by then?
Yeah, early 90s.
So you'd expect by that stage for things to have moved on ever so slightly. So the 90s sounds as if it was still.
Well, it's the end of the 80s, probably the end of the 80s and the 90s, dotted in various instances throughout my career as an independent, I have to say. Wow. I do know that one of our very, very revered dramatists, much loved TV dramatist, said to me that he always liked it when the script editor was attractive, because it made him want to work harder on the script, because then she might let him fuck her. And that was shocking. Wow. And this is the 80s and the 90s. So these are the things that you have to contend with. I have to say, none of these things were personally directed at me, in the sense that they weren't abusive to me, but they were being said.
Yeah, it's that sense of cultural sexism, isn't it, that's just pervasive of being there. And but it sounds like, you know, going back to the English Regent's Drama, it did sound, because maybe it's the kind of work that you were doing there, that as a band of people, that this was more liberal, this is more kind of slightly more progressive, perhaps, that the people you'd hope, you know. What
I think that there was a great emphasis on doing the work when in English Dream, doing the best work that you could possibly do. And I know that David Hare mentions this in his book, but the thing is that we were basically, actors had to travel to Birmingham, and they were away, everyone was away from home. And so you would spend, often instead of going home at the end of a day, you would go to the bar, and then all these directors and producers and actors would all be there stuck, and they would discuss the work. The work was extremely important, the quality of the work. And in that world, you just get on with it. You know, there was that whoever was going to do it the best was the best person to do it, and everybody was trying to do it the best way they could. So without I suppose that if there was an agenda, the agenda was get the work to be as good as it possibly can be.
May I ask, Tara, if you, I know you kind of went backwards and forwards to London, to Birmingham and so on. Did you find a difference in the kind of production culture that was there between those two different sites, really?
I didn't have anything to do with the production culture in London. Yes, all we used to do, we had a room on the top floor of the, not the main building, where we would be given a room for the day if we had to go and cast. But and people would come, because you wouldn't necessarily want actors to trek up to Birmingham just to meet you. But I didn't interact with the actual production people or the work in Television Centre at all.
Tara, I'm very conscious of time. We've got 2 minutes left, and I think we might, I don't know if we've got any time for questions. I'm so sorry, because I think I've got to pass to go to Ian. Is that right? But may I just say thank you so much, Tara, for participating in this. And it's been lovely to see you again and hear about your experiences. Thank you.